Disney has a problem when it comes to Star Wars. After all, the House of Mouse's handling of the iconic science fiction spacefaring property has been mixed. While there have been some successes like The Mandalorian, The Last Jedi, and so far Obi-Wan Kenobi, there have been some notable failures like The Rise of Skywalker, Solo: A Star Wars Story, and The Book of Boba Fett, or as I like to call it, The Book of Caca Fett, because it is shit. If anything, Disney's handling of the War of the Stars has been up and down, a true valley of soaring highs and abysmal lows, with a few solid outings like The Force Awakens and Rogue One: A Star Wars Story sprinkled in like cinnamon atop of whipped cream, atop a latte, atop a top. It's really been feast or famine. It has been Disney's A Star Wars Story. However, Disney has another issue than just its inconsistent handling of the Star Wars IP. In fact, Disney's take on George Lucas's crown jewel has been heavily focused on either legacy characters or the same three time eras, i.e. the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy, which are now dubbed the Skywalker Saga. Because branding is important, see Marvel Studios' The Infinity Saga, or HGTV's popular programming that I refer to as the vicariously watch people buy nice homes even though I'll be renting for my whole life saga. Know your audience. And in terms of Star Wars, Disney has been leaning heavily on established characters and conflicts ever since it started the sequel trilogy with The Force Awakens back in 2015. After all, the sequel trilogy featured legacy characters like Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Leia Organa, and had a main character in Rey who aspired to live up to their legacy, as well as a villain in Kylo Ren who desperately wanted to be the next Darth Vader. It was more or less a continuation of the story from the original trilogy, just set decades later and having new young original characters alongside the classic ones. Hell, the sequel trilogy even retreaded some familiar Star Wars ideas like space bases that shoot death lasers, a Jedi versus Sith conflict, the importance of the Millennium Falcon, a faction that is essentially the Rebel Alliance, read the Resistance, and a faction that is essentially Imperial, read the First Order. What I'm trying to say is that the sequel trilogy was like a cinematic Green New Deal that recycled so much from the original trilogy in terms of character, factions, and conflict, and while there were moments that broke new ground for the franchise, see Rian Johnson's awesome The Last Jedi, the more inspired elements of the sequel trilogy were ultimately undone by its third entry in the roundly criticized The Rise of Skywalker. It regressed into focusing on fan service, nostalgia, and played out storytelling that it was a lesser rehash of the classic films. Ultimately, the sequel trilogy, and by extension Disney's take on Star Wars as a whole, looked back instead of forward. The two standalone films in Solo and Rogue One did not help matters. In terms of Solo, the movie wasn't very good. It told an origin story of an iconic legacy character that honestly should have remained in the imagination. In the original trilogy, Han Solo had this aura and roguish mystique about him, and Solo kind of tarnished that by over-explaining his past. It wasn't a very enjoyable cinematic experience, and honestly was just unnecessary. As far as Star Wars adventures go, it was a third wheel. It didn't need to exist. It was the flaming hot Mountain Dew of Star Wars films. Admittedly, Rogue One, on the other hand, was decent enough. It was a film that had its own unique characters and told the once untold story of how the rebellion got a hold of the schematics that ultimately revealed a weakness in the Death Star. It is a fun film. But with that said, the movie has an unfortunate caveat. It is a prequel to the first Star Wars movie, meaning that the film gazed backward at a familiar conflict between the rebels and the Empire and rehashed yet another story about the Death Star, which between A New Hope, Return of the Jedi, and The Force Awakens, haven't we seen enough stories about a planet-destroying superweapon in Star Wars? It's kind of old hat, just saying. And sadly, Rogue One as a whole pulled on safe and iconic past Star Wars elements rather than telling us a wholly unique story. While sure, I do think the film is ultimately solid and nostalgia has its place, in retrospect, the movie was yet another example of a Disney Star Wars story that linked itself with the original trilogy. Similar to the sequel trilogy, it played up the nostalgia angle, and like Solo: A Star Wars Story, it was a prequel that retreaded identifiable ground in order to tell an untold story that didn't necessarily need to be told. After all, it exists in the same time span as a conflict that we all know well enough, and as a result, Rogue One, and Solo: A Star Wars Story as well, did not breathe new life into the Star Wars series. It forewent any sort of creative growth in favor of showing a conflict and Star Wars story tropes that audiences have been familiar with since 1977. Aside from a dark and interesting third act that has a lot of good character payoffs, as I said, the movie does have merit, Rogue One: A Star Wars Story story can't escape the fact that it dwells on Star Wars' past. Sure, it has original characters and portrays the Rebel Alliance with certain faults, which is admittedly interesting, but the movie still has an unseverable connection with Star Wars' previous storytelling stomping grounds, because as a prequel, that's by design. It exists in the same time span, covering the same conflict as the older movies. The Disney Plus series are guilty of this too. The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the future productions of Andor, Ahsoka, Skeleton Crew, The Acolyte, and Lando almost all entirely either focus on legacy characters and or take place in the same general time period, save for The Acolyte, which will be set 100 years prior to The Phantom Menace, which, okay, I'm intrigued. But even with that caveat, the majority of live-action Disney Plus Star Wars shows look at Star Wars in the rearview mirror, rather than create something from a different period of time in the Star Wars canon that sans the all-too-familiar factions and iconic legacy characters like Obi-Wan Kenobi, Boba Fett, Lando, and etc. Because as it stands right now, it's almost as if Disney is accepting the fact that Star Wars' best and most creative days are behind it. Kind of like how I view my 31-year-old joints and my old knees whenever I walk up a steep set of stairs. It's almost wistful, but it doesn't need to be this way. Star Wars can still be creative if Disney really wanted to put the effort in, because truly, Star Wars is a vast galaxy spanning many planets, histories, factions, aliens, and cultures. There is a lot of storytelling potential there. Disney has the power to create its own original Star Wars stories with original characters and original factions that have zilch in relation to the Skywalker saga, save for the fact that it would take place in the Star Wars universe. There is basically endless creative potential here. Yet Disney-era Star Wars productions just can't seem to stop making stories in the same three generational eras, spanning from the start of the prequel trilogy and culminating in the end of the sequel trilogy. And that's unfortunate, because there are honestly many other stories to tell that don't involve planet-destroying superweapons, Skywalkers, and etc. There is so much more out there, and honestly, Star Wars needs to look forward rather than backward. Admittedly, this doesn't mean that I'm against nostalgia or shows that expand upon past fictional events in the Star Wars universe. After all, the eras taking place between the end of the prequels and the beginning of the original trilogy, and the end of the original trilogy and the beginning of the sequel trilogy are rife with meaningful narrative exploration, especially when discussing live-action shows. And just because these TV shows do look backward, it doesn't mean that they still can't be good. See The Mandalorian and Obi-Wan Kenobi so far, but not The Book of Boba Fett, because that project should have stayed in the Sarlacc's digestive tract. But other than that, The Mandalorian and Obi-Wan Kenobi prove that Star Wars shows in these time periods can still be good. They can be worthwhile. But I will say that there needs to be more variety. There needs to be other shows and movies set in different eras of the Star Wars mythology than just the Skywalker saga. Modern Star Wars shows don't always need to be a prequel. And yes, I know that this series features a tagline stating that it all takes place a long time ago, a line that implies that Star Wars stories are ancient history, but Disney's entire approach to the Star Wars material didn't need to take that shit literally, because honestly, it's time for something new. It's time for Star Wars to be bold and look to the franchise's future. On one final note, I just want to highlight some potential developments on the production end of Disney's money-printing Star Wars apparatus. As stated before, the in-production show The Acolyte sounds interesting because it's set 100 years before this sexy horn demon murdered Liam Neeson. And then there's Taika Waititi's unnamed Star Wars project, which could potentially break the Star Wars mold, creatively speaking, though I'm just saying that because Waititi has a distinct style more so than any known details on the film, which there aren't any save for the fact that it's Taika Waititi's Star Wars film. It could potentially be the new direction I'm looking for, or it could just be another prequel series. We shall see. And while sure, Disney is still looking into the past, as given with its upcoming Disney Plus Star Wars shows, and the fact that Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins is developing a Rebel Alliance fighter pilot movie called Rogue Squadron, Star Wars may potentially finally move forward. And with that, we can only hope. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of Disney's handling of the Star Wars IP. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month allows you to start making review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones, and David Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.